Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow colleagues in this very moving debate about a critical issue facing veterans, and particularly to follow the member for Ayr, Carrick and Cumnock. And it's an area which shares a great affinity with Glasgow because, of course, it's the traditional home of the Royal Highland Fusiliers, the Glasgow and Ayrshire Regiment, which now forms part of the Royal Regiment of Scotland as its 2nd Battalion. I had the great pleasure of visiting two Scots at Glencorse Barracks, and the constituency of my old friend, the member for Midlothian. And we discussed a number of these issues facing serving personnel and indeed members of the regimental family who are now veterans. And I now also, as of July, count myself as a veteran myself, technically, having served 12 years as a reservist in the Royal Regiment of Scotland. I'm very proud to wear the regimental tie today. But I also wore the regimental tie on Sunday when I went to George Square to join many of my friends, as I have for several years, at the cenotaph to remember our own friends who have suffered life-changing injuries, and in one case my good friend who was killed in Afghanistan in 2013. So it's a moment for us both to reflect, but also for us to get together and have a good old time and have a social aspect to it as well. So Remembrance Day for many people isn't, particularly worn the uniform, is not just about solemn remembrance, it's also about having a bit of a laugh as well, which is always good. But we did get on to talking in great detail about many of our friends that have suffered. And in the last few months alone, the Royal Regiment of Scotland veterans have taken it upon themselves to set up a Facebook group to try and help each other. And that has been an eye-opening experience, just to see the level of difficulty that many people are going through, that often don't have the opportunity to make that clear to their comrades. I think there's a culture within, particularly the Army, that you don't talk about these sorts of things, that it's not seen as the traditional term would be to man up and get on with it, pull yourself together, and it would be an admission of weakness to say that you're having difficulties. So it's great that people feel that there's a safe space now for them to be able to make those vulnerabilities clear to their friends and seek help. And in that spirit, I actually welcome the thrust of this strategy that's been published, and particularly the cross-cutting factors that have been identified ring true to what I would like to see happen as a strategy. But I nonetheless feel concerned that the document is too high level, and there isn't enough understanding of what the outcomes are, what are the intended outcomes. There's broad intent here, which is laudable, but there is still a great deal of detail in how this is to be delivered lacking. I think back of the term that's used in the Army is mission command. So there's a general intent of what you want to achieve, but then you have to build up a fuller picture and a fuller structure of what actually is going to be delivered on the ground. And I find it quite ironic in many cases that for an organisation that has an effective command and control system built into its DNA, then when it comes to supporting our veterans and members of our arms and services who are no longer serving, that it seems to fall apart, that there isn't that same rigour applied. And I would like to see that addressed as part of the further development of this strategy. In particular, when we look at collaboration between organisations and coordination of veteran services, this is a crucial issue. The urgency burns through that. It needs to be gripped. There are many charities doing excellent work. Many have been mentioned today. A great example in the city of Glasgow and wider area is the Erskine Hospital, which was founded over 100 years ago by one of the Yarrow family, actually, who his son was killed in the battlefields of the First World War. And so riven with guilt was he that he pulled together people to form a charity along with one of the leading surgeons in Glasgow at the time, William McEwen, to create the first proper prosthetic limbs to help those who suffered life-changing injuries in the First World War. And it continues today to help veterans of all ages. But we have to recognise that the demographics of our veterans population is changing. The Army has downsized by around 20,000 regular soldiers in the last 5 years alone. That's a significant outflow of people, many of whom will have served in conflict zones, and very intense conflict zones at that. They will have very particular needs and very urgent needs that have to be catered to, and I don't feel that there is any sort of infrastructure there to deal with those specific requirements, and that needs to be dealt with. I have spoken on this issue a number of times in the last few months because many of my friends and many people who I know personally have been affected by this. Indeed, we've lost 4 Jocks from the Royal Regiment of Scotland in the space of 2 months from July and August this year. And that's a terrible rate of suicides. Indeed, there's estimated to be over 50 veterans who have taken their own lives in the last year alone in this country. I think we have to recognise the true scale of that issue, and to the point that was raised by my own friend about the level of detail in terms of data collection. We really need to get a grip of that situation. And other countries have shown the way how to deliver that. The member for Glasgow South hinted at that as well, but more robust infrastructure that helps identify veterans and we can help them. Often, when we think of a veteran, we're thinking of someone who's heroically served their country and is left in good terms and will go off and be a good character and deliver in civilian life. In many cases, veterans, well, technical term is anyone who's served one day in uniform is technically a veteran. And many will be discharged in difficult circumstances. Many will be discharged for drugs problems, reasons of personal chaos in their own lives. They will leave on very unhappy and difficult terms. And to be simply cast out and not given right support suggests that we are really failing them. And to think of the 4 jocks who took their own lives this year, in the last couple of months, in many cases they'd already reached out to get support. They'd tried to get support. I spoke to Combat Stress about members of the Royal Regiment of Scotland who had been seeking help with PTSD. Many of them identified themselves. Indeed, one of the men who tragically took their life, Jamie Davis, had been recording video diaries of his experiences. Haunting to watch now, really, knowing that he'd ended up taking his own life. And the descriptions that he uses to describe the difficulties he encountered are harrowing, really. And to think that we actually failed him. We all failed him. And I think that's something we really ought to take cognizance of. And the sooner we get this thing robustly developed and delivered in a meaningful way, we can't simply have these high-level aspirations. We need to have a robust plan that actually tells us in root and branch detail what we're going to do to make this different. And that's what we really need to understand. The charities do a great job, but many people, particularly veterans who work with charities, they maybe get some assistance. For example, they may do CBT with a charity. They find that it doesn't meet their needs. It's a box-ticking exercise in many cases. Right, we've consulted this veteran. He's presented himself and we've dealt with it, but it might not have resolved the issue, and there might not be ongoing support once that course of treatment is finished. And then they fall through the net. Then they find no other way out other than to take their own lives. That's the tragedy that's happening. It's not that we don't know they're there. We know they're there, but we're just not robust enough at helping them. And that's why I think we have to look at a structure that takes inspiration from the command and control structure that is embedded in the armed forces, to think about how we can robustly deal with that. My view is that there ought to be a consistent caseworker appointed to every veteran who leaves the armed forces, and that is a single consistent point of contact that they can turn to, regardless of the length of time. I think that would be an ideal structure, because often they fall between the net of different charities, different organisations having to repeat the same history, having to repeat the same issues. They end up overwhelmed with frustration. They disengage from this process, and then they find themselves lost, and then lost to their friends and family as well when they take their own lives. That's the true carnage and the cost that this is causing, and we don't know the true scale of it. It's maybe just the tip of the iceberg, the ones we identify. Veterans who find themselves in prisons won't identify as veterans. Veterans who find themselves in mental health problems, drug addiction, alcohol addictions, won't identify as veterans because they don't want to embarrass their friends. They don't want to embarrass their unit, their cap badge. So I think we have to get a grip of this on a number of fronts. I welcome the strategy in broad strokes. The cross-cutting factors identified about the improvements to data in the veteran community, public perception, understanding, recognition, and most importantly collaboration and coordination are laudable, but it doesn't go nearly far enough. We have a crisis on our hands in this country, and we have an ever-looming crisis where more and more people, there's over 100,000 people in our country have served in the theatres of Iraq and Afghanistan and operations Telic and Herrick. If we don't help them, we're going to have an absolute epidemic of mental health problems visited upon us. The needs of the World War II generation are different from the needs of the generation, my generation, have served in conflict zones in the last 15, 20 years. We have to get an understanding of how to tailor needs to help them. And I welcome the government's strategy. I think I echo the sentiments of my front bench, but we need to go much further to get a grip of it and deliver for our service personnel. We owe them nothing less.